Welcome to Campus Speaks, Hear Their Story. I'm your host, Doug Magnuson. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Lauren Thompson about her book, Friendly Enemies, Soldier Fraternization Throughout the American Civil War. Welcome, Dr. Thompson. For so long, the focus of history was on, as you say, tactics, strategy, and command, and not on the lives of the people actually involved in the fighting. Only relatively recently has the focus moved to the rank-and-file soldier and their experiences. I guess that you, like most historians, wish you could go back and talk to them about their experiences. What would you most like to know that you cannot or find very difficult to get at now?
That's a great question, and I've thought of that several times throughout the past decade that I've been working on this project. And what I really would like to know from a variety of soldiers is, how did you really feel? Because the letters that we use to learn about Civil War soldiers, a lot of them are written to perform, right? Or to assure their loved ones back home that they're okay. And when men wrote to female recipients, like their mothers, their wives, their sisters, they really wanted to shield them from a lot of the fear and the gory details. And on the other hand, if they were writing to male recipients, like brothers, fathers, friends, they wanted to be sure that they showed they could handle combat and they could handle camp life and the rigors of military life. And that's just the way antebellum men were, right? In a public sphere, you want to make sure you're showing your best self. But what men would do is tell one another in campfires and on the march how they were scared, how they were sick, they were lost, they felt trauma. However, those stories we really don't have anymore. For the men who write home, they're really trying to put on their best face. Now, don't get me wrong. They complain about their generals, the politicians, their rations, right? They're definitely going to be very vocal. But as far as, were you scared? Were you feeling a sense of dread about the end of your life, or what you really felt about combat? I would just love to know that, because men were afraid to really talk about their fears other than to their very close comrades. And because those were oral conversations they had during camp, we just don't have a record of that. So I'd really like to get into kind of what men felt at the time and how they made sense of the bloodiest war in American history.
Your book focused on the fraternization of soldiers in our Civil War. Would you please define fraternization for us as it applies to the military of that time?
Today, the modern term of fraternization is usually lower-ranking officers fraternizing with higher-ranking officers, or enlisted men fraternizing with the officer corps, right? Or fraternization is seen as soldiers and civilians. But the fraternization during the Civil War is neither. What I study is when men who are privates or NCOs are going to fraternize with the enemy and enemy soldiers of a similar rank. So we have Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers fraternizing with one another, meaning talking, trading, exchanging newspapers, all the great things that I talk about in my book. And so the interesting thing, however, is in soldiers' letters and diaries and during the Civil War, it was not called fraternization. So men did not say, hey, I went out and fraternized today. They would say, hey, I went out, and then describe that interaction. So only after the Civil War ended do we actually look back and call that fraternization. So it's a post-war term given to these wartime interactions, which made the research process very interesting, because I couldn't search things like fraternization. I had to search for coffee, tobacco, newspapers, picket duty. So it made it kind of fun to research, but that's the kind of fraternization in my book. Now, of course, fraternization between enlisted men and their officers, or enlisted men and civilians, that's still in the Civil War too. But in terms of the modern military definition and what I study, in my book, what I look at is the order that says you cannot have any communication with the enemy. These men break that order, and they have relations and interactions with the men they are trying to defeat.
Do you know of experiences of fraternization in American conflicts before the Civil War or after?
The number one kind of thing that most popular historians and most of the American public is familiar with is what happens in World War I between the Germans and the French and British troops. on the Western Front, specifically around the winter of 1914, the singing of Silent Night. It's kind of known as the Christmas Eve truce. And so that is probably the most familiar. However, as we know, American soldiers were not yet involved in that. So we do see some fraternization in the trenches in World War I. And then if we kind of pull back before the Civil War, there may have been some small instances of amnesty being shown in the American Revolution or perhaps the War of 1812, not so much when we get to the Mexican War or any of the Native Peoples' wars, when we see the American government and indigenous folks. And that's because there's a specific racial kind of barrier between Native peoples and those people who are of Hispanic descent. So we do see a little bit in American wars against Britain, but not to the extent that we see in the Civil War. Sometimes amnesty might be if they find a soldier wounded, they might give them some water, right? Or if somebody is dying, they might, comfort them by covering them up with a blanket. So we see small acts of maybe small fraternization, but nothing to the scale that we see in the Civil War. However, officers do fraternize in American wars before the Civil War. So we will see British and Continental officers come together for, communications, for meetings, for talks. And also we will see that when we see officers get certain privileges, like bringing their wives through the lines or having supplies move through enemy lines. There's usually a white flag of truce, and we will see officers exert their privilege to be able to have these accommodations. So in a sense, yes, it has happened, but to the extent that it happens in the American Civil War, we haven't seen anything like it before that time. And I really don't think we'll ever see anything like it in the future, because today, when we look at what is the battlefield, who is a soldier, looking at non-combatants, but also kind of the changes in what the battlefield is, I don't think hopefully we'll ever have anything like it in the future. So it really is an exceptional period of time. And I think it goes without saying that during the American Civil War, men looked the same, they spoke the same language, and they came from a common background. And so that also is kind of the way and the logistics that actually make it happen.
Was the Civil War different in this behavior?
Yeah, and that actually is part of it, right? That it is a civil war where the man across from you looks like you, speaks the same language, but also it's the tactics, right? We have large bodies of men who are stationed or ordered to be across from one another for very long periods of time, right? In some of those instances, they are told not to fire on their enemy. They are on what we call picket duty, which means you go out in front of the line, and for 24 hours, you have to stay awake and you have to watch the enemy. And then if an engagement is happening or you sense some sort of danger, you go back and let the people know something is happening in our front. So these men are out there for long periods of time opposed to the other side's picket line, right? And then later in the war, what we see is men are in siege or besieging one another, right? So that's trench warfare. And so we have large bodies of men about 100 yards apart from one another, dug in these trenches, and they're supposed to be killing each other, right? However, the men who ordered them into those spaces are in the background, right? The generals, the officers, they're safe, relatively safe in the background. And the men who were sitting up front in the picket lines and in the trenches are opposite of these men. So I really think it's the 19th century Civil War, early Napoleonic tactics, and then later in the war, we see the trench warfare develop that we see in World War I, right? And so I think the exceptional nature of the tactics we see, plus the notion of the same language, the same race, the same faith, I really think that sets the stage for fraternization to happen, because otherwise these interactions just wouldn't be able to happen. So that's the first thing that all these kind of stars have to align for these instances to occur.
You mentioned several times that the soldiers were surprised or not ready for the way of life that is the lot of the private soldier. You also state that fraternization was sometimes a way of rebelling against this. Why, do you believe, Did they feel the need to rebel?
That's a great question, and that's the heart of my study. And in the book, there's lots of ways that I kind of unpack this as we go throughout the wars, looking at different armies and different campaigns. But like most things in life, there's expectation and there's reality, right? And so I always use this analogy with my college students to describe this and to describe war, and they can empathize. They're like, oh yeah, like the first week of the semester versus the midterm. I was like, yes, right? And so when men come to war, they've heard stories about their grandfathers and their fathers seeing war and combat, and they want to prove their Americanness, prove their masculinity, prove their manhood. And a lot of times they think, I'm going to win receive a Medal of Honor, I'm going to capture a flag, I'm going to be standing on a trench and, being this leader and this hero and go back home and show my family and my town how amazing I am. However, for most of these men, more soldiers in the Civil War died of disease than bullets. So many of these guys met their fate in a makeshift field hospital, right? And when men are getting their bodies mutilated and limbs amputated, or even something as seeing combat and having the stress afterwards haunting you and not being able to sleep and feeling kind of the anxiety and the post-traumatic stress of combat. So there's what it's assumed to be, and then what actually happens. And so when men come to combat and they realize they are exposed to the elements, they are met with harsh weather conditions, they are drilling, they are marching, they are cutting down wood, they are manual labor, right? And then all along, you have to listen to some guy who probably got a promotion because he has a rich daddy, and then adding all the kind of political context onto what you're reading in newspapers and having critiques about your service, and then compile all that on top of the notion, am I going to live to see tomorrow? A lot of soldiers are going to feel like they have no control over their life anymore, right? And they thought, I'm going to go to combat and show my independence and my masculinity, but really, I don't have any of that I expected to have. And so something's got to give. And so what we see is soldier dissent or soldier resistance. And we see this kind of across race, class, and gender, right? In all societies. When the pressure cooker becomes too much, the lid has to come off. And so the way that men kind of resist is to go back to what they learned as children. And one was to have like petty thefts or petty games, banter, things to test the boundaries of authority. And that's kind of what fraternization is, right? The other thing that they do, and this is common still when we look at American manhood today, is when the world beats you up, who kind of makes you feel better? Well, partially women in your life, right? Your mother, your sister, your wife, but they're not there on the battlefields, right? So who do you go to as your male comrades, right? Whether it's going to a tavern or a fraternal society or even church, right? You have that kind of comrade bonding in the private sphere outside of your work or your business or your farm. Now, when the men get to the battlefield, that becomes the camp life, right? However, what we see with fraternization is that camp life kind of spills over into the enemy's camp, right? And so we have these men kind of acting separately, but when they go on to picket duty, we're going to see that those two separate spaces kind of overlap, like a Venn diagram. And so when it comes, going back to the types of resistance is, unfortunately, soldiers are going to resist in a variety of different ways. And there's the full spectrum, right? Some men run, they leave, they desert. Some men get drunk. Some men go to the brothel. Some men will fight their officers. Some men will fight one another. We even have cases of suicide, right? So there's very, very radical kind of active forms of resistance, right? However, fraternization is a little bit more passive, right? It's breaking a law. It's absolutely wrong. It's resistance. But at the same time, men who do it feel like it's an honorable or a respectable interaction. And that's kind of something I learned throughout the research, because unfortunately, we like to put things in dichotomies, right? Good soldier, bad soldier, courageous soldier, coward. follows orders, breaks laws, right? So we kind of compartmentalize men into this or that. However, soldiers aren't always that simple, right? Some guys wake up and say, today is going to be a lovely day. The sun's out. It's all for the Union. The next day they say, I can't wait to go home. This war is the worst thing ever and I might run away, right? So the temperament of men fluctuates throughout the war. And it really could be anything as simple as they have a hole in their sock and their toes cold, right? Or their commander just changed and they don't like the new guy, right? So all of these factors are influencing men. And so men have, I guess, their own decision to say, how can I get back some control? Now, some men desert, some men will be violent, right? Or some men may say, I'm going to sit down. I'm not going to fight today. However, fraternization, on the other hand, most Civil War scholars before my study put fraternizing men in that category. They said they're bad soldiers. They're not motivated. These are the guys who are breaking rules. Therefore, they're not the good soldier. However, my study kind of shows there's a nuance. And just because a soldier does a bad thing or breaks a rule doesn't mean that he's uncommitted or he's not loyal. And the only reason I could find this was by reading their letters and diaries, because of the 150 soldiers, both Union and Confederate, that I found who fraternized, the majority of them either survived the war or died in combat. They also received medals of honor, they were promoted, and they were the type of guys that would say, hey, somebody deserted or was drunk, and I'm upset by that, right? So they would criticize other guys in the same letter that they fraternized. So they saw like the radical deserters as not like them, whereas they were kind of breaking a law, but it was a safe way or it was a respectable way that kept their manhood intact. So the way that they talk about these things, made it really easy for me to find it, unlike other forms of dissent that we have to go through court-martial records to find. But it also allowed me to realize these guys were steadfast. They were loyal. They hated copperheads in the North. They hated traitors. They hated people who deserted, right? They wanted to see this through to the end, and they wanted to be a part of it. And so in a lot of letters, I will see men fraternize, and then they come back and say, this is all for the Union, or say something that really shows like they're ready to fight. So in a way, fraternization was a form of resistance that allowed men to remain in control, allowed them to make their present circumstances better, and then also live to fight another day. And so that's kind of where resistance, fraternization, and kind of how soldiers react to this gap between expectation and reality all intermingle and come together in my study.
Weren't there very strict penalties for doing this?
I spent a lot of time in DC in the National Archives reading through Union court-martial records. Now, we don't have Confederate court-martial records, but we do have Union court-martial records. And so there is over 8,000 cases for men who did bad things and were brought up under court-martial. And of the 8,000 cases, I found about 36 cases on fraternization. So in comparison to things like desertion or conduct unbecoming of a soldier, fraternization, there was only, a smattering of cases. However, General Lee, General Hooker, General Grant, General Burnside, A.P. Hill, and General Longstreet all passed ordinances as Corps and Army commanders to their men that any interaction with the enemy, whether it be in between the lines or shouting across the lines or trading or anything like that, will result in an arrest and a court-martial. And so officers made it very clear to their men, you cannot do this. And then for men who were caught, they were then sent to a court-martial. Now, of the, I would say about 40 court-martial cases based on fraternization, about half the men were acquitted, about half the men were brought to charges. And so first, let me start with why they were acquitted. I think the reason men were acquitted is because there was no evidence. It was kind of a he said, right? So if you're gonna go out and trade coffee and tobacco, They're going to smoke it. They're going to drink it. There's really no hard evidence. The men who were charged usually had hard evidence, and that hard evidence came in the form of an enemy paper, right? So if you were a Union guy and you had a Richmond Examiner in your possession, there's only one way you could have gotten that paper, and it was from a Southern soldier, right? And so when men are charged on Articles 56 and 57 of war, they usually had some sort of evidence on them. And the penalties for fraternization were relatively light in comparison to other offenses. So we see men who are going to have forfeiture of pay, so they don't get paid for anywhere between 3 to 6 months. Men are sent to hard labor for 6 months. Some men were given penalties like one man had to stand in front of his regiment with kind of a sign on him that said offense, I think it was like offender. And so that's kind of the public humiliation that was used to deter men from fraternizing. So it was most definitely illegal, but I only found about 40 cases of fraternization that went to court-martial, and I found 150 guys who fraternized. So either officers say we have bigger things to deal with, right? Or it was happening under the covert ways that soldiers could execute these actions, whether it be darkness, whether it be outside of officer surveillance, or the lower ranking officers who were in the front lines with them took part in it too. So it's really kind of interesting. And a lot of that I don't know, just because, men would say I fraternized, but they really wouldn't say how they got away with it. Sometimes I could deduce it, but that's what makes it really interesting. And I think it's why so many men partook in it, because they felt like, okay, this is something we could do. Because if the officers don't want to come down here with us on the front lines, then we can do this and be okay with it.
What kind of fraternization took place?
This is kind of how my chapters are organized in the book. And I kind of hinted at some of this already. So the way that soldiers fraternize, first, we have to think about greasing the wheels of sociability, right? And the way men kind of reach out to one another when they're unsure of the other party is joking and banter, right? We see it at sporting events, right? We see it in social interactions. We even see it in like the corporate business world, right? You kind of send out that line and see if they're going to get anything back, right? And so we see men on opposite sides shout out to one another using jokes, right? So they use jokes and banter. Sometimes, Confederates will yell out, if they've lost a battle, like, hey, how's Burnside over there? Or what's Abe Lincoln up to today? So they'll kind of have these jokes to say like, okay, they're not, extremely hostile right now. We might have a chance to see what can happen. So communication starts at a kind of a long range kind of distance. But then men start to travel together into that space in between the lines. Now, sometimes it's a river, and so men will cross a river. Sometimes it's a ravine or the space in between trenches. And so sometimes men will meet in the middle, and that's when they'll really have conversations, right? About the war, about their rations, about lots of different things. So communication is key. And once communication happens, then we see the exchange of commodities. So what we're going to see is Union soldiers really want tobacco from the South, right? Because of kind of now, tobacco gets in between the lines, but all that goes to officers, right? Or they can purchase it, but it's rather expensive. So what men really want is tobacco. It gives you that kind of pop, you feel better, you can stay awake on picket duty. And Southerners, because of the blockade, really want coffee, right? You want that warm cup of joe. What Confederate soldiers are doing is they're basically like taking like bark off of trees and smashing it and putting hot water, right? They want that coffee. And so they're going to exchange coffee and tobacco in some ways that are so creative. I won't give all the ways, but I will say one of the ways that was one of my favorite is after the Battle of Fredericksburg in the winter of 1863, two armies are stationed on the Rappahannock River, and the Rappahannock's too deep for men to go across. So instead, when they're on picket duty, they construct little toy boats, and they put the commodities on the boat and push it across the river, and then they send it back. So sending toy boats, right? These are 19-year-old guys, right? They're gonna be creative, create these little boats, and send them back and forth across the river. And so we'll also see other types of commodities like food, clothing, souvenirs, things exchanged between the lines. The next kind of important thing that is exchanged is something I've already talked about, which is newspapers. And that is extremely important because when you are in the ranks, right, when you're in the thick of it, you don't know what's going on outside your army. You don't know what's going outside in terms of prisoner exchanges, emancipation, the 1864 election, other armies, the home front, the political administrations. You want to know. And what better way to know if what you're doing every day and the suffering you're going through is making a difference than to read it in an enemy paper, right? And so what men do is, instead of listening to camp rumors that circulate and don't give you a lot of information, they're going to exchange papers with enemies. And they do this quite frequently. And that goes back to that idea of having some control or being in the know or having some power, right? I certainly am risking my life and my standing in the army to get this paper. But if I can do it secretly, have an equal exchange, I can go back to camp and read about what the Southerners think of my service, right? Or what my army and what my efforts are doing. Are we getting any closer to seeing this thing through and going home? And the last kind of way men fraternize is the most important, and it's the way that we see fraternization evolve from something that's fun and makes life a little easier or get some information to an actual life-saving maneuver, and that is the negotiation of ceasefires. And so when soldiers have orders to keep a constant fire on the enemy or have sharpshooters there, so if your head or your hand pops up above the trench, you're going to get hit, right? And so when we see the sieges at Vicksburg, Atlanta, Petersburg, especially those in the years 64 and 65, right? The last thing a man wants to do is have his comrades stand up to go use the bathroom, right? Or get a cup of water and be shot in the head, right? These are veterans of campaigns, and to die by a sharpshooter's bullet in the trenches is really hard for a lot of these men to see. And so they say, you know what? We can take this into our own hands. And so what men do is they reach out across the lines and say, hey, Johnny, hey, Billy, let's stop firing. Let's just call a ceasefire. And what men do to keep these ceasefires going is they will say, you know, if we have to break it, like if a new unit comes down or if an officer comes down, we'll fire 2 warning shots to let you know that the ceasefire's ended. And so a lot of people hear this and they go, well, isn't that counterproductive? Like, aren't you, helping the guy who you're trying to defeat? But we have to think we have the advantage of hindsight, right? We know the siege of Petersburg breaks in early April, okay? But these guys have been besieged for 10 months, right? And it's March 30th. Did they know that they only have 2 days left to hold tight and they're going to break through? No, right? They don't know if they're going to see the next day. So if they can go down into a very dangerous, volatile space and be able to have this agreement to say, you can read, you can sleep, you can eat, you can relax, and you won't be killed today, they're going to take it, right? We all would take it. And so in their minds, they don't know when the siege is going to break. They just know, I'm back in the front lines. I don't know if I'm going to live through today. And if I can use, of all things, my enemy to try to survive and be pragmatic and use this as a life-saving measure, they're going to take it. And that's what comes in the later years of war and is really what fraternization, I think, helps a lot of men to stay in the ranks and survive and make it to the end of the war and be able to then become veterans. And so those are the ways that men fraternize. There's a few other creative ones and some really cool stories. Most of these men are infantry, but we'll see some cavalry fraternization. We'll see some officer fraternization. And so in the book, I give a lot of specific examples of how these happen and also how men will even turn on their own comrades who are skeptical about breaking some of the ceasefires. And so it really shows you how men kind of come together to see their life continue and not fall victim to a casualty in the trenches as a 4-year veteran surviving campaigns like Antietam and Gettysburg and Spotsylvania. And then you find yourself in Petersburg, and the last thing you want to do is not make it through the war because of this continuous fire that you're experiencing every day. And so fraternization has many different levels, but those are the most frequent and the most common and the most significant that I found.
Did these interactions have any effect on morale?
They really did. And that is kind of my whole kind of piece for looking at this, right? Is the way that we look back at the Civil War and think about morale, we think it's when you win, right? You have a victory. But A, when you're in sieges, victories aren't quick, right? Or B, when you're in slaughters like Antietam and Shiloh and Chattanooga, there really are no winners, right? Because yes, you held a position, or yes, you took a position, but someone in your unit died. You might have lost a limb, right? And after that bloodshed, you're really no closer to finishing the war, right? And so a lot of times we say indicators of morale are victories or defeats. But that is very easy for us to put on these men when we realize, like, even if you win the war, the battle, there's still so much left to conquer. And there's obviously, for even the winners of a siege or a campaign, a lot of death and bloodshed and trauma that takes place. And so that kind of goes back to the point I made earlier that men are going to try to grasp at anything they can. And we see men cling to a lot of things for morale boosters. They love getting mail from home, right? They love getting letters. They love being able to read what their loved ones are doing. Many men cling to their faith. What we mostly see is men cling to one another, right? They're close comrades. And so fraternization is an option, right? If it could happen, right? If the circumstances are right and armies are close together, to be able to get something, to be able to talk about something, to get some information, to be able to control your circumstances. And I really think that makes men feel like, okay, I'm not just this cog in the machine, doing the bidding of these men who are ordering me into these situations that are life-threatening, and I can have a way to feel like I have some sort of autonomy over the situation. And however small that is, I think when you're in a sea of death and trauma, it goes a long way. And again, maybe not sustainable for weeks or months, but if you get a paper or you have a ceasefire, you're going to end that day feeling, okay, I survived this day, and I feel good that I was able to do this on my own terms.
Did it have any effect on the larger morale of units or armies? I
would say no. And the only reason I say no is because earlier when I started this project, I had some backlash from people saying, well, fraternization didn't change the outcome of the war. It didn't change the outcome of battles. And I said, well, that's not what I'm trying to do with this, right? Like, I'm not going to say, the fraternization at Petersburg, made the Union, Grant's army break through. No, there were way many other circumstances, right? But I do think on a small level, right, for unit cohesion, individual morale, because soldiers are very individualistic, right? They're very pragmatic. That's how American men are throughout many different generations, but especially in the antebellum generation, right? They grew up kind of with this individual kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, the market revolution, capitalism, and they really feel like sometimes I'm in it for myself, right? And so if an individual's morale gets better, the men around him get better. If they fraternize as a group, they feel more of kind of this cohesion and they have this experience that unites them. So at an individual company level, maybe a regimental level, absolutely. As far as the armies, I wouldn't say it goes that far. And I just think because there's so many other circumstances that go into that. And that's why you can kind of see it in the crackdown of the arrests and the court martials too, right? They really don't want men deserting, right? They really don't want guys drunk. They're going to crack down on that every time. But I think they're like, oh, they exchange coffee and tobacco. not going to change the course of this campaign, right? So I think fraternization is not as, I guess you could say, significant in determining the course of a campaign or a battle, but it is for small unit cohesion.
The soldiers state many times that the exchanges were often jovial and kind. How did they switch between these interactions and trying to kill each other?
That is what I continue to think about, right? Even after my book was published and I held it in my hand, I still would wonder this question. And I think I answered it as well as I could in the book, and it's kind of woven throughout all the chapters. But I'll give you a hint about why I think soldiers were able to kind of flip back and forth. Is soldiers are able to compartmentalize things very well. And one of the ways I see them compartmentalize things very well is between what is a safe space where I can let my guard down and what is a space of danger, right? And we do see these kind of come together when we see sieges, right? This is where I'm living, but I'm also in constant fear. And so I think men are able to kind of switch between, okay, let's have this interaction to preserve life or to get something we need, but they're kind of these like nameless gray faces, right? So they're using the enemy for themselves, right? It's not necessarily, I'm friends with this guy now and I don't want to fight anymore. It's almost this kind of, I don't want to say selfish, but definitely an individualistic reaction to say, I need you to help me. And now that I got what I needed and I can't really get anything else from you anymore, or you present yourself as a danger, I'm going to flip back, pick up my rifle and continue to fight you, right? And so soldiers are very good at being able to compartmentalize, but also go back and forth all day from joking, fighting, joking, fighting, joking, fighting. And it's miraculous. And I give a lot of examples in the book of how soldiers do this, what they say, what they think about. And it is kind of something that we can look at broader in terms of American history, is how we are able, after a tragedy or when we do bad things to one another, how we're able to reconcile. And I think we see these kind of interactions as these like mini reconciliations of, yes, we're in the Civil War. Yes, we have done bad things and slaughtered one another across this landscape. But we also know that eventually, especially at the end of the war, when the Confederates know that it's only a matter of time, eventually we're going to have to reunite. And so perhaps that's one of the reasons men are able to continue these kind of jovial versus dangerous interactions so quickly, because eventually they know reconciliation is inevitable.
Did the interactions between Union and Confederate soldiers foreshadow or set the tone for Reconstruction?
Absolutely. And I think this is where my book really presents something with another kind of area of the Civil War and something else I study, which is race, which is African Americans, which is slavery and emancipation. And the reason this is so important is because Black men are going to put on the uniform, and 180,000 Black men are going to be at the campaign of Petersburg, right? And while these men, Black Union soldiers, go on to picket duty, guess what Confederates don't do with them? Is fraternize, right? When they see their former slaves, right, in uniform across from them as equals, they have, for lack of a better term, white rage, and they lash out at these men, right? And then we even see Union soldiers calling Black soldiers, their own comrades, very negative, pejorative terms, while fraternizing with the enemy, right? And so we see this clash of race and masculinity in the final years of the war. And unfortunately, what we see is there's this moment in time, right? And it's held with white Union soldiers. I could choose my comrades or I could choose my race, right? And for most Union men, they choose reconciliation over racial reckoning, right? And saying in this post-war world, we are going to have to recognize Black citizenship. But instead, they kind of say, no, we're going to reconcile with our Southern comrades at the expense of the freedmen. And a lot of Civil War scholars say, at Appomattox, that's when the guns fall silent, and now we can begin the process of reconciliation, right? But in my book, I say, no, these guys were having conversations about when the war's over all the way back in 1862 in Virginia, right? And so we don't have to look to Lee and Grant at Appomattox. We don't have to look to the Republican Congress in DC. We don't have to look at the Freedmen's Bureau and, people coming down to the South to try to, reconcile. We can actually look all the way back into the war when we see common soldiers, Union and Confederates, on the river in these ravines having these conversations about, I wish this war was over, let's go home, right? But the only thing with those conversations they have about reconciliation and reunion is they never talk about what terms, right? Union soldiers don't say, well, are you guys gonna give up your slaves, right? They say, are you gonna do this again? Are you gonna say you're sorry? Are you gonna take away the Confederate flag? How are you gonna get back in the Union, right? They never talk about the terms. And the problem with that is the reunion is quite easy. It's quite simple. And as we know, Confederates were not really punished for their mistakes. And so what we see with reconciliation and reunion is the same conversations the men had in the trenches during fraternization as the same conversations we're going to see the entire country have after 1865. One that champions sacrifice, honor, courage, but doesn't ask the hard questions, right? Which is the cause of the war of slavery, the aftermath of the war, which is Black citizenship. And so unfortunately, in that Reconstruction period, we emulate what the soldiers did, which was kind of talk about the commonalities and not the pressing critical issues of what our country is going to be after this reckoning over this issue of slavery. And so that's kind of goes into my last chapter, which is about the memory of fraternization, how it can be a very powerful tool for people who want to say, look, we've always got along, right? Look at these guys in the ranks. They're doing all of this throughout the war. See, the war wasn't that bad. And that minimizes the bloodshed. That minimizes the horrific nature of why this war happened. And so unfortunately, fraternization in the post-war period becomes kind of its own, as I call fraternization 2.0. It becomes its own entity. And for the guys that used it during the war to survive, politicians are going to use it after the war as a political agenda. And that's somewhat unfortunate, but also kind of going back to your question of why these men set the tone for reunion, and we don't have to look after 1865 to see how it was done. We can look at these guys during the war.
Thank you, Lauren, for sharing with us today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this talk, and I hope you're excited about reading all of this in the book.
Lauren Thompson is an assistant professor of history at McKendree University. She completed her PhD at Florida State University in 2015 and her master's at West Virginia University in 2010. Her book, entitled Friendly Enemies, Soldier Fraternization Throughout the American Civil War, was published this summer by the University of Nebraska Press. She also produced a chapter and collection entitled A Forgotten Front, Florida During the Civil War Era, Tuscaloosa, Alabama University Press, 2018, and an article in Civil War History. Dr. Thompson received research fellowships at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and the Virginia History Society in Richmond, Virginia. At McKendree, Lauren teaches the following courses: Civil War Era, African American History, Race and Ethnicity in U.S. History, American Revolution, Labor History, and U.S. Women's History. In January 2019, she received the McKendree University's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Humanitarian Award. During her graduate school years, she worked as a seasonal ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park in Virginia.
McKendree is more than a university. It is the pillar on which academic excellence is built. It is the place you can call home. It is where athletic prowess thrives. McKendree is a place where its educators are dedicated to the success of each student they teach, no matter the platform. McKendree is a community that gives back both locally and globally. McKendree is the place where you can make your dreams a reality. Make it possible. Make it matter. Make it McKendree.